the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Let's all begin with Sankirtan. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Vishnu Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Nityanamine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Mate Bhakti Vedanta Shanyavadi Satyadashatarine Sarvati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shanyavadi Satyadashatarine Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitya Gaura Hari Bol Nitya Gaura Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitya Gaura Hari Bol Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jai Gaura Hari Ki Jai Jai Prabhupada Ki Jai Jai Govinda Hari Hari Bol. So again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're going to continue with our discussions and the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. We are going to be speaking on chapter 21, and we will begin with our prayers. Om Jnanam Timirandasya Gnananjana Shalakaya चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्येन कृष्णं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकदामाह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकम्। ॐ विष्णुपदाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्तस्वामिनिति नामिने नमस्ते सरस्वतीदेवे गौरवाणी विचारिणे विशेषशून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशतारिणे. So thank you all so much for the opportunity to serve by presenting this overview on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. It's a wonderful book that was written by Srila Prabhupada, and it's based on the biography of Lord Chaitanya called Chaitanya Charitamrita. Chaitanya Charitamrita was written by Srila Krishna Kaviraj Goswami. So I pray for all your blessings to do justice to this class as we try to understand the Lord's teachings and pastimes better, so we can love and serve Him better also. So this 21st chapter of the teachings of Lord Chaitanya is called "The Mayavadi Philosophers Are Converted." So Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had met with a group of fairly belligerent Mayavad philosophers led by Prakashananda Saraswati, a great sannyasi of the Mayavad order, who was at the time in Varanasi, Benares, now called Varanasi in India. And they had asked Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to explain Vedanta in the correct context, which the Lord did, and that we discussed in our previous chapter. And the sannyasis were convinced, and we will discuss the glorification of the Lord today. So we'll begin by chanting the invocation prayer, the first 18 of the Adi Leela, the first part of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda Jai Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. The translation is: Glory to Shri Chaitanya and Nityananda, glory to Advaita Chandra, and glory to all the devotees of Shri Gaura. So we will read. In this way, Lord Chaitanya condemned attempts at indirect interpretation of the Vedanta Sutra, and all the sannyasis present were struck with wonder by his explanation. So you can only imagine the great good fortune of these sannyasis who are hearing Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. But then when we think about it, we also have the opportunity to hear from the Lord. Every time we open the Bhagavad Gita or the Srimad Bhagavatam, we read the Lord's words with me. Also read of his pastimes, and we hear from those devotees who are faithful to the Lord's words and instructions. And we're also hearing from the Lord in person. It is, of course, in time that we will realize that we are directly hearing from the Lord, and then we will appreciate this great mercy that He has given us. After hearing the direct interpretation, one of the sannyasis immediately declared, "Oh, Shripad Chaitanya, whatever you have explained in your condemnation of the indirect interpretation of Omkar is not at all a useless argument. So, only a fortunate person can accept your interpretation as the right one." This is a very significant point that this sannyasi is making. So the Lord lovingly takes the effort to explain so many things to us in the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, in so many different contexts, of course, here with these Mayavadi sannyasis. And every emanation that comes from the Lord, whether it is an actual physical creation or whether it's the Lord's words and instructions, are all perfect. Right? We are reminded of the invocation verse of the Sri Upanishad, which says, Om Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachate Purnasya Purnam Adaya Purnam Eva Vashishyate. So the translation is, the personality of Godhead is perfect and complete. And because He is completely perfect, all emanations from Him, such as this phenomenal world, are perfectly equipped as complete whole. Whatever is produced of the complete whole is also complete in itself. Because He is the complete whole, even though so many complete units emanate from Him, He remains the complete balance. So, of course, this verse also nicely sums up our discussions from the last 2 weeks, where we were saying that no matter how many creations come from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Absolute Truth, he is always complete. He never diminishes in any way. And just like all his creations listed here are perfect, so his words, his instructions, as well as even this phenomenal world are also perfect. So this is a point that His Grace Raghunath Bhattacharya explained very nicely this weekend. That people could argue, though, that this world has so many imperfections, right? There's crime, there's war, there's poverty, there's climate problems, there's so many issues. But when we look at it closer, we'll understand that the Lord has created the world perfectly, but it is us who are imperfect. And by our imperfect actions, we create the imperfect reaction. That is what all the ills of the world today, that's where it all comes from. Otherwise, the world, this phenomenal world is perfect and complete, and so are the Lord's instructions. So just like we misuse this world, people misuse the Lord's instructions. They use his words, his teachings, in order to further their incorrect philosophy, particularly this Mayavadi philosophy, and that is where the problem comes in. So that's why the sannyasi is saying that the Lord's teachings are indeed perfect and not useless, but there are certainly, he hints, useless people who are going to misinterpret the Lord's instructions on Omkar and on everything else, actually, which they have done, to Vedanta, to Bhagavad Gita, and so on. It's only the fortunate who are actually able to appreciate the Lord's word as it is, as the Lord intends it to be understood. So we have that very good fortune to have these literatures available to us by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, so that we can understand the Lord's words, the words of Lord Krishna, the words of Lord Chaitanya as they are meant to be. And when we do understand these teachings, we have a duty to preach it to others so that they can also have the correct understanding, and that will certainly please the Lord and our acharyas very much. The Mayavadi sannyasi continues. Actually, every one of us now knows that the interpretations given by Shankara are all artificial and imaginary. But because we belong to his sect, we took it for granted that his interpretation was the right one. We shall be very glad to hear you further explain the Vedanta Sutra by direct interpretation. So this is a good point about association. So the sannyasi concedes that even though logic and common sense will declare that the explanations of Shankaracharya are certainly not correct, but when one is in the association of this sect, then one is hearing this philosophy all the time, and one is being preached to it, instructed by people who believe in it, and through their contaminating association, one becomes convinced of it also, right? And the Mayavadi sannyasis are not just convincing each other, they're convincing everybody else as well. So this is why we are careful to avoid arguing with them, because they're quite good at arguing, very good at grammar and quoting shlokas and misinterpreting shlokas. And they could also damage our faith and our understanding of the scripture. And Prabhupada says in the Science of Self-Realization that for us to be quoting and counter-quoting Sanskrit shlokas from the scriptures is not the ideal. It's not going to actually achieve anything. It's certainly not going to help us advance in devotional service. Even if we were able to defeat any Mayavadis by this process, there isn't a guarantee that they'll even take to Krishna consciousness. And that is because taking the spiritual life is a function of mercy. If one hasn't earned that mercy or gotten that mercy from pure devotee, they're not going to take the spiritual life, even if our arguments are very strong. There's a nice example from His Holiness Gaura Swami Maharaj. He was explaining that he was preaching once to a Christian minister, and through the course of Maharaj's arguments, he could see that the minister's points were being defeated progressively. And Maharaj then understood that if he progressed on the line of discussion, that the minister would lose his faith in Christianity. The issue is, of course, that he wasn't necessarily going to get faith in Krishna consciousness. So if his faith is destroyed completely, and he doesn't, of course, develop in the spiritual if he doesn't develop in spiritual life further to the devotional service of the Lord, then basically his faith has been completely broken in all respects, and he'll probably become an atheist. So Maharaj therefore discontinued the discussion at that point, thinking it wise, of course, that the gentleman should continue with his faith as is. So we also have to have that emotional intelligence to understand when and how and to whom to preach, so that we don't have unintended consequences that are not good for others and for ourselves. So doesn't mean though that we can't help the Mayavadis at all. So we've discussed the point many times that debating them is not the way. We can pray for them, but nothing to be sniffed at. Praying is always important. But we can also take inspiration from the Bhagavad Gita, the purport of chapter 3, text 26, where Srila Prabhupada writes, therefore, a realized soul in Krishna consciousness should not disturb others in their activities or understanding. He should act by showing how the results of all work can be dedicated to the service of Krishna. The learned, Krishna conscious person may act in such a way that the ignorant person working for sense gratification may learn how to act and how to behave. So, for the most impossible cases of Mayavadis, we can at least be the very best example of Krishna consciousness that there is. We can be mature, dedicated, loving, sincere practitioners of spiritual life, and this will inspire them. Right? The example that we set will be our preaching. As we demonstrate to them how we have been transformed for the better, then they can be transformed as well. That's our actual preaching. Then Srila Prabhupada continues. Although the ignorant man is not to be disturbed in his activity, a slightly developed Krishna conscious person may directly be engaged in the service of the Lord without waiting for other Vedic formulas. For this fortunate man, there is no need to follow the Vedic rituals, because by direct Krishna consciousness, one can have all the results one would otherwise derive from following one's prescribed duty. So, someone who's slightly inclined to Krishna consciousness, that person can be engaged a bit more. So we could, for example, get their advice on subjects that they may be expert in that we can use in spiritual life. They may be good at IT, for example, or graphics or accountancy. Of course, we don't take their advice on spiritual matters or philosophy, but they can use their talents and abilities in the Lord's service. We can engage them in donating to projects as well as donating their time. Many people are inclined to render services, humanitarian services in particular. We can engage them in that. We can just invite them to program, to hear kirtan, to hear classes if they would agree to that, or at least just to take prasadam. So even without taking their association, without hearing discussions on philosophy from them, we can engage them in these methods of devotional service, and then they will certainly make progress from being most unfortunate to being more fortunate. Being so requested, Lord Chaitanya explained each and every aphorism of the Vedanta Sutra according to the direct interpretation. He began by explaining the word Brahman, indicating that Brahman means the greatest, the supreme personality of Godhead. The word Brahman indicates that the greatest is full with 6 opulences. In other words, the personality of Godhead is the reservoir of all wealth, all fame, all strength, all beauty, all knowledge, and all renunciation. So it makes sense that by any definition, in any religion, for that matter, God is referred to as the greatest. Right? We've said many times that if God isn't the greatest in relation to everyone else in creation, then simply he's not God. Right? So the Mayavadis have their first challenge in that they don't hold the supreme to them, which is impersonal Brahman. They don't hold their supreme person, sorry, they don't hold a supreme feature of God, impersonal Brahman, responsible for creation. It doesn't fit into their beliefs necessarily. But say they did, they would have the problem that they don't ascribe attributes to Brahman. So if Brahman doesn't have attributes, Brahman also can't be the greatest in all respects, because to be greatest means to have attributes, like is listed here: wealth, fame, strength, and so on. So it means that even a simple creation in this material world, like us, with our forms, would therefore have more attributes than Brahman. We have nice families, for example. Brahman would not have that. We would have wealth, even if not all the wealth, but at least some wealth, which Brahman doesn't have apparently either. We can also display knowledge, some of us to a greater degree, beauty, and so on. And with each of this, Brahman, who doesn't have attributes that are greater than these, because Mayavadi say that Brahman has no attributes, it means that Brahman would technically be less than all of us, not having any better qualities than we have. So we understand that everyone then, in some way or the other, is expressing some kind of opulence in this material world. Everyone has something about them that's different or special. And the Mayavadis, by reducing Brahman to being featureless, without attributes, also means that Brahman doesn't have any opulence. Right? It means that they are diminishing the standing of Brahman. And yet, at the same time, we can see clearly in the wonderful pastimes of Krishna that he displays every opulence. Right? We can actually say that anything that we can do or anything that we have, Krishna can do and Krishna can have better. Not only his pastimes, but also his teachings explain this also. The Lord tells us that not only does he display unlimited opulences, but he's also the source of all our opulence. To whatever degree we have something special or wonderful about us, all our powers or abilities all come from Krishna. Okay. There are some persons, of course, some entities that have a greater concentration, we could say, of the Lord's powers than others. And then the Lord teaches us more about this in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So this chapter is called the opulence of the Absolute. And Krishna is explaining to Arjuna how different entities and different personalities are all exhibiting some extraordinary power of their own, which they are getting from Krishna. So we remember, for example, that the Lord said that the season of spring is especially wonderful as compared to all the other seasons. The Himalaya mountains is particularly wonderful compared to all the other mountains. The sage Brigu is particularly empowered out of all the sages and so on. There were many wonderful descriptions in that chapter. So we can say that that these persons or there's animals in some cases, these entities are all endowed with more greater concentration of power than you and I have. But at the end of the day, of course, all the powers come from Krishna. They're sort of like they're called vibhutis. They're sort of like a little less empowered than the Shakti Avesh avatars. We remember that Shakti Avesh avatars are also souls like us that are empowered, especially by the Lord. So the vibhutis are also empowered in a certain way, but not as much as the Shakti Avesh avatar. But the point is that everyone's power, everything's power is coming from the Lord. Okay. So the Lord says in the same chapter, in text 41, Yad yad vibhutimat tattvam Srimad urjitam eva va tat eva vagachatvam mama tejam sambhavam. The translation is, know that all opulent, beautiful, and glorious creations spring from a spark of my splendor. Okay. So we can see very clearly in all ways, in all descriptions, that Krishna is always supreme above his creation. That even more than that, everything is resting on him, drawing power and ability from him, that nothing can exist independently of him. Whether those entities are getting their powers in extraordinary amounts like the vibhutis, or whether they're ordinary like us, everyone depends on the Lord, as is expected from a supreme God, a supreme being, a supreme absolute truth. So certainly this makes more sense than the Mayavad explanations of a supreme Brahman that is not only not creating anyone, but is also not responsible for anyone's power and can't display power of its own, right? So we ourselves as well, through the Mayavad explanations, we can't be considered supreme either. What powers and abilities do we display that are greater than Krishna? Right? So only Krishna himself has shown to be the ultimate power, the ultimate ability, the ultimate opulence, and therefore he, of course, is the supreme absolute truth. When Lord Krishna was present personally on earth, he exhibited these six opulences in full. No one was richer than Lord Krishna, no one was more learned than Krishna, no one was more beautiful than Krishna, no one was stronger than Krishna, no one was more famous than Krishna, and no one was more renounced than Krishna. Therefore, the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna is the Supreme Brahman. This is confirmed by Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, text 12. Param Brahma, Param Dhama. You are the Supreme Brahman, the ultimate, the supreme abode. Therefore, Brahman indicates the greatest, and the greatest is the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna. So this is abundantly clear, right? The Bhagavad Gita is the most accepted authority, not just by all the Gaudiya Sampradayas, but also in Hinduism of Sanatana Dharma as it is. And it's the most relevant text, especially because the Bhagavad Gita is summarizing all the Vedic knowledge, and the Vedas themselves are not easily accessible to people, what we speak of understandable, and certainly we see that there's so many misinterpretations of the Vedanta as well. So this salient authority, the Bhagavad Gita, is being quoted here where Arjuna is calling Krishna Param Brahma, right? He's calling Krishna the Supreme Brahman. Now, Arjuna on that battlefield is only speaking to Krishna. Only Krishna is present on the chariot with him. The only other argument that the foolish commentators can make is that Arjuna was speaking to the unborn unborn within Krishna. And we have debunked this crazy idea many times before. And simply we'll say that if a Brahman is so supreme, surely Brahman would be able to speak for itself, right? And not speak through Krishna, for example. So we would be pretty crazy to say that a supreme entity, a supreme absolute truth won't be able to express itself, right, without the help of someone else. Some supreme being that has unlimited power should have the power to speak, especially since all the inferior creations like us are able to speak and express ourselves. So let us be sensible and just accept that Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme and Ultimate Absolute Truth, was the one speaking Bhagavad Gita about himself, and Arjuna was directing his comments to that Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna when he said, Param Brahma, you are the ultimate. Okay. So one of the problems that people face in accepting Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that they see this youthful, happy, beautiful God, and they think that without the weapons, without the big form, many arms, without the big throne, the fierce followers, and also, of course, without the need to just throw benedictions around to please everybody, how can he be God? So they ignore the fact that Krishna has repeatedly shown the opulences of God everywhere, simply because of their envy. And Krishna himself calls them fools for that. They're so envious that he doesn't have to be some old, harried guy sitting on a boring cloud somewhere, smiting everybody, or that he doesn't have to be a god or a goddess fighting demons all the time, and that he doesn't have to be some force field or light who doesn't have fun or doesn't have a life, right? Instead, Krishna gets to have all the fun. He gets to be young and beautiful and famous and rich and knowledgeable, right? And renounced as well, even though he has the most loving associates who would do anything for him, who would never betray him, and quite simply can't get enough of his association. So the envious can't stand it. They actually can't stand the fact that this is the ultimate reality, because that's how we would want it. Right? That is the ultimate reality that we're trying to recreate in this world, isn't it? If we could be God, we wouldn't be smiting and creating and administering the universe and dealing with ridiculous requests from people who don't know what's good for them. Nor would we be some light somewhere. Who'd ever choose to just be a light? we would also hopefully have the intelligence to create incarnations of ourselves to be able to do whatever only God can do. And then for everything else, dedicated servants like the demigods can obviously um, perform those functions in the universe for the Lord as their servants, right? And then the Lord, Supreme God, would do what they want to do. Okay, so how can we expect that God would make any less of a plan to spend His time? He has a better imagination than us. If we can think of how many ways we can have a good time in this material world, the Lord can certainly do the same with all His unlimited power, right? The best thing that He can come up with is not going to be alive. We have to think about it carefully. In fact, for that matter, the Mayavadis are teaching us that we could actually become God and be a part of that life. But if we have to think about it, why would we settle for that? Why would we, if we were going to become God, choose to be that for all of eternity? Why would we not get to choose what we could be, what we could do, or where we could be for that matter? If it's all just being forced on us, so we don't have a choice. Well, you can be God, but you actually have to settle for being God as being alive. It's a lot less than the choice that we get in this material world, where at least we can choose where we can live, who we can associate with, what we do for a living, for example. So it obviously means that this concept is seriously flawed, right? And if we can't have any autonomy as God, then why would we choose to be Brahman in the first place? So we continue reading. He is the shelter of the absolute truth. This is Krishna. He is the shelter of the absolute truth, Paratattva, because he is Param Brahma. Okay? So we're not denying, we never deny that Brahman, impersonal Brahman, is a feature of the absolute truth. This we have said many times over. But impersonal Brahman is not the ultimate feature of the absolute truth. Okay? Brahman is resting on Krishna, not the other way around. And we've understood it quite in many different ways. And now we're saying that through the abilities that Krishna alone, through the opulences and so on that Krishna displays, it's Krishna that has all the features of Brahman and Paramatma and then some. It's not that Brahman has all the features. And so if Brahman doesn't have all of Krishna's features, then Brahman can't give rise to Krishna, who has more features than Brahman. Okay. The only way that the fools can argue against this is by saying that all the features that Krishna does have, right, all his attributes and all his opulences are material. And they say this because they claim that Krishna's form is material. In that way, they make it that Krishna is less than Brahman. But we have again said repeatedly that God is unlimited. The Vedas are stating this, as well as every other authority. So if God is unlimited, how can we say that he doesn't have enough power to create or to have a perfectly spiritual form for himself? How are we limiting his powers to say that he can't be in a form that is eternal, blissful, and full of knowledge, to experience all the pleasures that we can experience in this world? We simply cannot keep limiting God by saying what he can't do when he's supposed to be a supremely unlimited being, right? By all definitions, including the definitions of the Vedas, which the Mayavadis claim to be authorities on. There is nothing material in his opulences of wealth, fame, strength, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. All the Vedic verses and hymns indicate that everything about Krishna is spiritual and transcendental. Wherever the word Brahman appears in the Vedas, it should be understood that Krishna, the supreme personality of Godhead, is indicated. An intelligent person at once replaces the word Brahman with the name Krishna. So this intelligence that we have, we should be so grateful to Srila Prabhupada for. Right? It's because of him, his mercy, that has been the qualification for us to understand all these teachings. Right? He has made all of the Vedic teachings so clear, to the point that the name of Krishna is indeed replacing Brahman all over the world. Right? All this knowledge is spreading all over the world, and this dreadful scourge of materialism, this flawed teaching of impersonalism, is being defeated. Right? Much to the dismay of those who are envious of Krishna. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is transcendental to the material modes of nature, but he is fully qualified for transcendental attributes. To accept the Supreme as impersonal is to deny the full manifestation of his spiritual energies. So although we are fortunate to have this intelligence, the Mayavadis are not so lucky, right? It makes, for some reason, um, no sense to them that even though it makes sense to them somehow that even though all the Vedic scriptures that they are quoting from and speaking from say that Brahman is limitless, but they limit Brahman, not just saying that Brahman can't have a wonderful, blissful, spiritual form that's perfect, but they're also saying that Brahman can't have a wonderfully blissful spiritual abode, right? They think that this world may be indeed an illusion to them, but they're also saying that there can't be any other kind of perfect spiritual form either. Okay, it's a bit of a foolish thought. It's like those who claim that God doesn't exist. Right? They're those persons who say that because God doesn't exist to them, God doesn't. Sorry. They are those foolish people who say that because they don't believe in God, God doesn't exist for them, but God exists for others who do believe in Him. So it's like saying that I don't believe in rain, so if I go outside in a storm, I won't get wet, but the other people who do believe in rain will get wet. So God exists, right? And whether we want to believe in Him or not, it's not going to change the fact that He exists. And in the same way, to the Mayavadi, even if they don't believe that He can create and can maintain and exist in a happy, beautiful, blissful spiritual abode, that abode still exists despite their faulty beliefs. Since the Supreme Brahman, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is full with all varieties of spiritual energy, one who simply accepts the impersonal exhibition of spiritual energy does not accept the absolute truth in full. To accept the Supreme in full is to accept spiritual variegatedness, right? Spiritual variety, which is transcendental to the material modes of nature. By failing to accept the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the impersonalists are left with an incomplete conception of Brahman. So the full Brahman is impersonal Brahman, yes, but it's also Para Brahman. It's also Krishna with form, and Krishna's abode with form, and all of Krishna's manifestations, his name, his qualities, his pastimes, and so on. Right? They simply by saying that this is not possible, it doesn't mean that it isn't possible for the Supreme Lord. If we can have in our imagination a world that is free of birth, disease, old age, and death, if we can imagine a world without misery, suffering, pain, ignorance, anger, pride, and so on, actually, it actually makes you think of the song by John Lennon, right? Imagine. So if we can imagine a world like that, simple people like us, a simple material songwriter, can we think that God Himself not only can't imagine such a world with all His infinite abilities, but He can't create such a world as well? So the answer comes down to envy again. The reason that the impersonalists can't accept Krishna having a perfectly wonderful spiritual form, and the reason that they can't accept his wonderful spiritual abode is simply because of envy. Right? The scriptures tell us that this abode is existing on devotional service. This world is the spiritual world is full of devotional service to the Lord, and those who are envious of Krishna don't want to serve him. They don't want to be engaged in devotional service. They want to be him. They're still suffering from the envy that got them to this material world in the first place, and they're still infected by the false ego that makes them want to be the ultimate controller. So they'll never accept the reality that is built on devotional service to Krishna. They would rather deny the spiritual world. They would rather deny the whole existence of Para Brahman and rather state that impersonal Brahman is supreme, thinking that they can actually become one with Brahman. But what kind of power and ability will they have in that way? When we said that Brahman is basically to them just a light that doesn't do anything and can't actually have anything or display anything either. So there's not even much power that they're going to gain from that anyway, even if they could become one with Brahman. So we must be so very careful not to be fooled by such arrogant people who can so nicely quote scripture according to their misunderstanding and fool people. This is how impersonalist philosophy has been spreading over millennia. We must be so very careful not to fall into such traps. The approved methods method for understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, is a part of devotional service. And this is confirmed in every Vedic scripture. The devotional service of the Lord begins with hearing about Him. There are 9 different methods of devotional service, of which hearing is the chief. Hearing, chanting, remembering, worshipping, all these are used in the process of attaining the highest perfection, understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This process by which the Supreme Personality of Godhead is understood is known as Abhideya, practice of devotional service within conditioned life. So we've understood now quite clearly that the impersonalists don't have the correct understanding of the Supreme Absolute Truth, and therefore they're not going to know the way to attain the Supreme Absolute Truth. We need to know our goal in order to know the way to that goal. So we understand, though, again, through the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, making all the Vedic teachings so accessible in a time where it's very difficult for us to understand the Vedic teachings properly, and we certainly are short on time for that. Srila Prabhupada has made us understand that the absolute truth is Krishna, and that we can be engaged in devotional service even as we are before we've attained to Sambandha properly. So what is Sambandha? Sambandha is the first stage in spiritual life where we're trying to understand who we are, who Krishna is, and what our relationship to Krishna is. So even while we're trying to get to that point, because Sambandha is actually a realization, it's not just knowledge. Even while we're trying to become realized in this, we can still be engaged in the practice of devotional service as given to us by Srila Prabhupada. And we can therefore make progress towards Sambandha sincerely. And then when we do reach that platform of Sambandha, we've realized our identities, then we can actually start devotional service in earnest. And that pure devotional service will be called Abhideya. Okay, that's the second stage. And when we prosecute Abhideya with faith and mercy, then we can attain to the third stage, which is Prayojan. So this is the goal of spiritual life, because Prayojan is where we are actually at the stage of pure love of Godhead. And we see how that's possible in the next few paragraphs. But we have many wonderful scriptures to guide us in that regard. We have the summary Veda of the Bhagavad Gita, we have the commentary on the Vedanta, which is the Srimad Bhagavatam, and we also have the advanced Rasa Tattva of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which is offering what through Lord Chaitanya's mercy, what no other incarnation gave before. So Srila Prabhupada's merciful and expert presentation has given us all of the knowledge that we could ever need to base our spiritual practices on, so we can actually attain Sambandha, Prayojan, Sambandha and Abhideya, and eventually Prayojan as well. In practice, it is experienced that one who takes to Krishna consciousness does not like to deviate to any other consciousness. Right? So, of course, the best way to situate ourselves in the right consciousness is through hearing. So we've read that it is the most powerful, the most fundamental of all the devotional practices. By hearing the words of the Lord as He wanted us to hear it, with the meaning that He wanted us to understand, through the realized teachers in spiritual life, with attention and eventually with love, we will be able to easily perfect our devotional practices. Krishna consciousness is the development of love for Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and this is the fifth and highest interest of the human being. So we say fifth interest, so what are the other 4? So those 4 interests or 4 goals of human life are religion or dharma, artha or economic development, karma or sense gratification, and moksha or liberation. So in all the teachings of Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism, these 4 goals are prized as what is commonly desired by the human race: dharma, artha, or moksha. And most people are actually interested in the first 3, right? Religion, even these days, religion not so much, but at least artha and karma, economic development and sense gratification. And they generally engage in karma yoga for these 3. The Mayavadis are in particular interested in the last one, in moksha, right? Moksha, liberation, is the goal for them, and they utilize the process of jnana yoga to attain this. But all of these, we have understood through the scriptures, are temporary. They're all material. The benefit of achieving them all doesn't exist beyond this life. And the only way to approach the absolute truth is not through these, but through the fifth goal, which is love of God. Right? Only love of God is truly spiritual. Only love of God can persist beyond death to benefit the soul in their journey towards the absolute truth. And therefore, only love of God is worth trying to attain. Someone who has actually achieved this love of God doesn't have any interest in the other four things, nor in the processes of karma and jnana to try and achieve those. When one takes to this process of transcendental devotional service leading to love of God, he relishes his relationship with Krishna directly. And so this is the goal. This is what happens in Prayojan. And from this reciprocation of relishing transcendental dealings with Krishna, Krishna gradually becomes a personal associate of the devotee. Then the devotee eternally enjoys blissful life. Therefore, the purpose of the Vedanta Sutra is to re-establish the living entity's lost relationship with the Supreme Lord Krishna, to describe the execution of devotional service, and to enable one to ultimately achieve the highest goal of life, love of Godhead. So we can see what is written here is actually those three goals of Sambandha, Abhideya and Prayojan. Okay, re-establish the living entity's lost relationship with the Supreme Lord Krishna is Sambandha. To describe the execution of devotional service, that is Abhideya, and to enable one to ultimately achieve the highest goal of life is love of Godhead, right? That's Prayojan. The Vedanta Sutra describes these three principles of transcendental life and nothing more. So we said the Vedanta Sutra, being the condensed knowledge of the Vedas, is actually giving us the heart of the Vedas in these three principles. That's the most important thing. And so the Vedanta is actually even divided in this way. And through that, we understand that everything in the material world, spiritual world, all religious principles, all scripture, everything is about helping us to understand these three principles and eventually to get to the goal of Prayojan. And this is why this is the message of the Vedanta. So if we stick to the teachings of Srila Prabhupada, then we'll definitely achieve all of this by his mercy. And that's what makes the difference between us and the Mayavadis or anyone else who tries to understand scripture without the mercy of the Acharya, of the spiritual master. That we need mercy in order to get to the right conclusion. This is essential. After Lord Chaitanya explained the Vedanta Sutra by directly interpreting the aphorisms, the chief disciple of Prakashananda Saraswati stood up in the assembly and began to praise Lord Chaitanya as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. The chief disciple not only very much appreciated the explanation of the Vedanta Sutra by Lord Chaitanya, but he publicly stated the direct explanation of the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutra, that is from Lord Chaitanya, is so pleasing that we forget ourselves and also forget that we belong to the Mayavadi sect. We must admit that Shankaracharya's explanations of the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutra are all imaginary. We may sometimes accept such imaginary explanations for the sake of sectarian feuds, but actually such explanations do not satisfy us. It is not that one becomes free from material entanglements simply by accepting the order of sannyas, but if we actually understand the explanations given by Lord Chaitanya, we will be helped. Indeed, Sri Krishna Chaitanya's explanation of the verse beginning Hare Nama, Hare Nama, Hare Nama Kevalam is pleasing to all of us. So hearing about the scripture from the Lord, right, from Krishna on the battlefield, from Lord Chaitanya, from Srila Vyasadeva to his disciples, as well as from all the authorized representatives of the Lord, the Acharyas, from Srila Prabhupada, from all of those who are following Srila Prabhupada's teachings faithfully. This is pleasing and it is life-changing. It helps us to understand our goal and it helps us to understand how to get there. We need to look beyond trying to just perform a lot of activities to try and get noticed, try and accumulate knowledge like how the Gyanis do by trying to get powerful in the material world. We need to understand that by all of this, we're not going to attain that ultimate goal. We need to be focused on the Hare Nama, the holy name of the Lord. That pure chanting is actually what we want. This is what will help us achieve that pure love of Godhead, which is the ultimate goal of life. Right. So thank you all so much for your kind attention. Please join us next week when we continue the discussions on this wonderful chapter. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Srinivasa Gaura Hari ki jai. Are there any questions or comments, any clarifications or explanations I can try and help with?
Hare Krishna, dear Mataji. Please accept my humble
Thank you so much,
obeisance. All
dear.
glory to
Please
Srila
know that,
Prabhupada.
of course.
No questions from my side, just to thanks very much to you. Very wonderful class. Nanda Pranams.
Thank you,
Haribol.
Masterji. Thank you. And thank you all for joining this evening. Sorry for the short notice.
Matsuji, we have before stories from Bhagavatam and just finished a quarter past 8. For this reason, I was late and I haven't the link.
No, no. No
My
problem.
apologize. My
I'm
apologize.
actually very sorry that. No, no worries at all. It's absolutely fine. I'm actually sorry for the late minute, uh, last minute message that we're having class today. Thank you for joining. Anyway, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much. Very thankful and grateful to you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Haribol.
Thank you. Hare Krishna. Are there any other comments or questions? If there are none, we will go on to our bhajan today. So today is also the return Rath Yatra. Lord Jagannath left his temple called the Sri Mandir in Puri, and he went to the Gundicha Mandir last week, right? In a very wonderful procession, very beautiful and an awe-inspiring procession down the Grand Road in Jagannath Puri Dham. And it is said that the temple where Lord Jagannath usually resides throughout the year, that's representing the opulence of Dwarka, and Krishna goes to the Gundicha Mandir for a week, and there Gundicha represents Vrindavan. And it's a wonderful atmosphere of Vrindavan, and the wonderful devotees who serve the Lord with the purest love in Vrindavan. So today, Lord Jagannath is going back, and we will invoke Sri Vrindavan Dham with the famous bhajan Jai Radha Madhava to mitigate the Lord's separation in some way from his beloved Sri Vrindavan Dham. And we'll just put up the words for that. This is a very powerful bhajan by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur that Srila Prabhupada actually went into ecstasy over. I was interested to know that there's another name, and the official name for Jai Radha Madhava is actually Sri Krishna Vimsattara Satanama. And it's from the book by Bhaktivinoda Thakur called Gita Vali. So a lot of the songs of our acharyas were actually compiled into books by them. And we have the benefit of being able to sing these bhajans in order to remember the wonderful pastimes and activities of the Lord and his devotees. Okay. Shri Radha Madhava ki jai, Shri Shri Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Maharani ki jai, Shri Shri Sai Gaura Hari ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Shri Sai Gaura Premanandi. So we'll read the translation. Krishna is the lover of Radha. He displays many amorous pastimes in the groves of Vrindavan. He is the lover of the cowherd maidens of Raja and the holder of the great hill named Govardhan. He is the beloved son of Mother Yashoda, the delight of the inhabitants of Raja, and he wanders in the forest along the banks of the river Yamuna. So we'll just mention that special information at the bottom. Srila Prabhupada was very fond of this song, song, and sang it just before his lectures. In Allahabad and Gorakhpur, Srila Prabhupada fell into a trance after singing the first two lines, and after some time he came back into external consciousness and said, "Now just chant Hare Krishna." Srila Prabhupada said that the song is a picture of Vrindavan. Everything is there. Srimati Radharani, Vrindavan, Govardhan, Yashoda, and all the cowherd boys. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Again, thank you all so much for joining us and for bearing with us with the change in having class today and not tomorrow. Keep well and please join us next week. Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai. Hare Krishna, everyone.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hari Bol.
Hare Bol.